I read the text once, then again, hoping I had misunderstood it. Mom, do not come. My wife's family does not want you here. That was it. No explanation, no apology, just a sentence that erased years of sacrifice, loyalty, and quiet endurance. In that moment, I realized something devastating and undeniable. I was no longer seen as a mother, only as a convenience that had outlived its purpose. The pain was not loud, but it was deep enough to crack something permanent inside me. And once that crack appeared, everything I had been avoiding finally came into focus. Before we dive into today's story, take a moment to share where you're watching from. We love seeing how our stories bring people together from every corner of the world. Your thoughts and comments are what make this community so special, and we're truly grateful to have you here. If you haven't already, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss a new story filled with drama, resilience, and unexpected twists. Now, settle in, get comfortable, and maybe grab your favorite drink, because this is a tale you won't want to miss. Let's get started. My name is Evelyn Moore, and I am 58 years old. For most of my life, I have been the kind of woman people describe as steady, dependable, and composed. I live alone in a quiet townhouse overlooking the coast of San Diego, California, where the mornings are cool and the ocean air carries a sense of order that I have always needed. From the outside, my life looks complete. I am financially secure, professionally respected, and free to choose how I spend my days. Yet even in this calm, I have learned that comfort does not mean safety, and independence does not protect the heart. For more than 3 decades, I worked as a senior financial advisor, managing long-term investments for corporations, retirement funds, and private clients who trusted me with their futures. I built my reputation on discipline and caution. I knew how to read contracts, how to assess risk, and how to walk away from deals that felt wrong, even when the numbers looked tempting. I had no trouble saying no in boardrooms filled with men who underestimated me. But at home, I was a different woman. With family, especially with my son, my instincts softened and my boundaries blurred. I became a widow 12 years ago. My husband's passing was sudden but not dramatic in the way people expect grief to be. Life did not collapse. It simply narrowed. From that moment on, everything I did was shaped around raising our son, Daniel Moore. I worked longer hours, turned down personal comforts, and convinced myself that sacrifice was the natural language of motherhood. I did not resent it. At the time, it felt like purpose. Daniel grew up watching me work hard and stay composed. He was intelligent, polite, and ambitious, and I believed I had done something right. When he became an adult, I helped where I could, quietly and without conditions. I told myself that support was not control, and generosity was not weakness. Looking back now, I see how easily those ideas can be confused. Things began to shift after Daniel married Claire Whitman. Her family was everything mine was not. They came from established wealth, the kind built over generations, protected by tradition and appearances. They were courteous to me, never openly rude, but there was always a distance I could feel but not name. At gatherings, I was thanked, never consulted, included but never centered. I was present, yet invisible. I noticed how conversations changed when I entered a room, how decisions were made before I arrived. No one dismissed me outright, but no one asked what I thought either. Over time, I understood my place clearly. I was not part of their inner circle. I was the woman behind the scenes, the one who helped without being seen. I told myself this was fine. All that mattered was that my son was happy, stable, and accepted. Still, there were moments when the silence felt heavier than words. I began to sense that my reliability had become expected, not appreciated. I had spent years believing that love meant endurance, that being needed was enough. What I did not yet understand was that being needed is not the same as being valued. As I stood in my kitchen each morning, watching the light move across the floor, I believed my life was settled. I did not know then that this quiet stability was fragile, or that my willingness to remain in the background had taught others exactly how far they could push me. I was calm, capable, and unaware that the ground beneath me was already beginning to shift. If you're still watching and you can already feel something is not right beneath the surface, comment number 1 below, so I know you're with me. Because what looked like a normal family dynamic at first is about to reveal cracks I never expected. Now, let's move on to chapter 2. Daniel came to see me on a quiet Sunday afternoon, the kind of day when the ocean breeze drifts lazily through the open windows and time feels suspended. He looked relaxed at first, sitting across from me at the dining table, talking about work, traffic, and small things that did not matter. I noticed, however, that he kept circling back to the same pauses, the same unfinished sentences. As his mother, I knew that look well. He was preparing me for something. Eventually, he told me about the project, a coastal resort development in Santa Barbara, California, elegant and understated, meant to attract a discreet, wealthy clientele. He did not begin with the numbers or projections. Instead, he spoke about family, about how important appearances were to Claire's parents, about how they had always dreamed of a place where the whole family could gather, celebrate milestones, and feel proud. He spoke about shame, about how difficult it was to stand beside people who had inherited comfort when he had not yet built it for himself. I listened carefully, wearing 2 identities at once. One part of me was the financial advisor who had spent decades evaluating risk. That part saw warning signs immediately. The timing was uncertain, the market volatile, and the structure vague. The other part of me was a mother who remembered the boy who once came home from school afraid he was not good enough. That part wanted to ease his burden, even if the cost was my own hesitation. When I asked practical questions, the air shifted, Daniel's tone tightened, and I sensed frustration beneath his politeness. Claire sat beside him, composed and quiet, offering little input of her own. Her silence felt deliberate, as though she was allowing the pressure to build naturally. I was careful not to challenge them directly. Instead, I asked about legal structure, voting rights, and safeguards. The questions were reasonable, but they landed poorly. I could feel myself being cast, subtly, as the obstacle. I made my position clear in the only way I knew how. If I were to invest, it would be transparent. I would be the primary investor, with proportional authority and documented protections. This was not a matter of control, but of responsibility. Money, especially family money, has a way of blurring lines if those lines are not drawn early. The Whitman family agreed, at least outwardly, but I sensed discomfort beneath their smiles. They were accustomed to generosity without conditions, and I was offering neither blindly. As preparations moved forward, small things began to stand out. Meetings happened without me. Updates were brief and often delayed. When I asked for documents, they arrived late, already summarized, as if my role were symbolic rather than substantial. Claire often answered questions meant for Daniel, her tone smooth but firm. I told myself this was simply the dynamic of their marriage, not a warning. Deep down, something unsettled me. I had spent my career trusting data over instinct, yet here I was ignoring both. I recognized the pattern, but chose not to name it. I wanted to believe that my son would never put me in a vulnerable position. I wanted to believe that my caution was simply fear disguised as wisdom. In quieter moments, I wondered why my presence felt less welcome the closer the project came to life. I reminded myself that families operate differently, that not every exclusion is intentional. Still, the feeling persisted, faint but insistent, like a low hum beneath the surface of ordinary conversation. That evening, after Daniel left, I sat alone at the table long after the dishes were cleared. I knew I had seen the first signs of imbalance. I knew I had felt the shift in power and expectation. Yet I chose reassurance over confrontation. I told myself that trust was an act of love, and love required faith. It did not occur to me then that by ignoring my unease, I was teaching them exactly how far my faith could be stretched. If you're still here and starting to sense the quiet manipulation hiding behind polite smiles, comment number 2 below. What happened next was not an argument, not a warning, but a single message that changed everything. Let's move on to chapter 3. The morning of the launch event arrived quietly, almost deceptively calm. I woke early, as I always did, and moved through my routine with the same measured pace that had guided most of my adult life. Outside, the sky over San Diego was clear, the ocean steady and untroubled. It felt like an ordinary day, and that ordinary feeling reassured me more than it should have. I believed I was simply attending an event connected to an investment. Nothing more, nothing less. I dressed without hurry, choosing something understated and appropriate. I was not trying to impress anyone. I did not expect a spotlight. Despite everything that had unsettled me in recent weeks, I still assumed I would be there as I always was, present but peripheral. I checked my phone more than once, waiting for details from Daniel. The exact time. A message confirming where I should meet them. Something that acknowledged my role, however quietly. Nothing came. As the hours passed, the silence grew heavier. I told myself he was busy. Events like this were chaotic, and Daniel had always struggled with organization under pressure. I resisted the familiar urge to fill in the gaps with excuses on his behalf. Still, I waited. I had learned long ago that patience was often rewarded. It was late morning when my phone finally vibrated. I was standing near the window, watching sunlight spread across the floor, when I saw Daniel's name on the screen. For a brief moment, relief washed over me. That feeling lasted only until I read the message. Mom, do not come. Claire's family does not want you there. I read it once, then again as if repetition might soften the meaning. It did not. There was no greeting, no explanation, no apology, just a statement, clean and final. The words settled slowly, like cold water seeping into fabric. I felt my chest tighten, not with anger, but with confusion. I tried to understand how such a decision could be delivered so casually, through a screen, without a single acknowledgement of what it implied. I called Daniel immediately. The call rang until it stopped, unanswered. I waited a few moments and tried again, telling myself the timing was unfortunate. The result was the same. I sent a short message asking him to call me when he could. There was no response. My unease sharpened into something more defined when I reached out to Claire. The call did not ring at all. It went straight to voicemail. I stared at the screen longer than necessary, then tried one more number, one belonging to her parents. The line was blocked. There was no ambiguity left to cling to. This was not confusion or miscommunication. It was intentional. I sat down slowly, my phone resting in my hand, and looked around the room. Everything was exactly as it had been an hour earlier. The furniture, the light, the quiet. And yet, something fundamental had shifted. I realized that I had been moved from the margins to the outside, excluded not by circumstance, but by choice. What unsettled me most was not the exclusion itself, but the ease with which it had been executed. Decisions had been made without me, about me, by people whose comfort I'd helped secure. I wondered how long this moment had been planned, how many conversations had taken place in which my absence was assumed. I did not cry. I did not raise my voice or send another message demanding answers. Instead, I sat with the truth as it revealed itself. For the first time, I allowed myself to consider a question I had avoided for years. If I were not Daniel's mother, what place would I have in this world they were building? After some time, I stood and placed my phone on the counter. I decided I would not attend the event, not because they had asked me not to, but because I needed clarity more than presence. A line had been drawn, not by me, but through me. And as I stood alone in my quiet home, I understood that this message was not an ending. It was the beginning of something I could no longer ignore. If you're still watching, and that message shocked you as much as it shattered me, comment number 3, so I know you felt it too. Because the real damage didn't stop there. What I discovered next turned suspicion into undeniable truth. Let's move on to chapter 4. After the message, I did not leave the house. I did not turn on the television or scroll through social media. I let the silence settle, not as punishment, but as space. Outside, the day continued as if nothing had happened. Somewhere up the coast, people were gathering, glasses were clinking, speeches were being made. I was not there, and for the first time, I stopped trying to explain that absence to myself. When shock faded, habit took over. I did what I had always done when something felt wrong. I sat at my desk, opened my laptop, and pulled up the project files. The posture of a mother gave way to the posture of a professional. Years of training returned quietly, almost gratefully. I stopped asking why and began asking how. I reviewed the main contract first, line by line, then the email trail that followed. At a glance, everything appeared intact. The language was polished, the structure sound. But familiarity can be dangerous. I read again, slower this time, letting each clause stand on its own. Small inconsistencies began to surface. Terms that had once been precise now felt softened. Authority that had been clearly defined appeared diluted by conditional phrasing. None of it was overt. All of it was deliberate. I moved on to the supplemental documents. There were more versions than I remembered, each labeled as a revision, each time-stamped within days of one another. That was when I saw it. A new appendix, quietly added after the original signing date. The formatting matched the rest, but the creation time did not. My name was still there, but my role had changed. Where I had once held proportional voting rights, I was now listed as a financial contributor only. No authority, no leverage. I compared signatures. The one attached to this appendix was mine, but not freshly signed. It was a digital reproduction, lifted from an earlier document and placed where it did not belong. The realization arrived without drama. I was not mistaken. I was not imagining things. This was not a misunderstanding born of hurt feelings. It was manipulation, careful and calculated. I leaned back in my chair and closed my eyes. Images from the past weeks resurfaced with sudden clarity. The meetings I had not been invited to. The summaries sent instead of full reports. Claire speaking on Daniel's behalf, as if ownership had already shifted. The quiet resistance whenever I insisted on clarity. I had noticed all of it, yet chosen reassurance over recognition. What surprised me was not the betrayal itself, but how long it had taken me to admit it. I had trusted my son with an openness I never extended to clients or colleagues. I had confused emotional closeness with ethical safety. In doing so, I had given them room to redefine me, not as a partner, but as a resource. There was no anger in that moment, only resolve. I understood now that this situation would not correct itself. Silence would not restore balance. If I allowed this to stand, I would lose more than money. I would lose the right to define my own worth. I began making notes, precise and unemotional. Dates, file versions, points of discrepancy. I created a list of contacts I had not yet called, people who would understand the language of contracts better than the language of family. I did not reach out to anyone that afternoon. There was no need to rush. The strength of a response often lies in its preparation. As evening approached, the house grew dim, the lights softening around the edges. I closed the laptop and sat quietly, not in grief, but in acceptance. The doubt I had carried for weeks had crystallized into clarity. I knew what had been done, and I knew what I needed to do next. I had been patient long enough. Now, I would be precise. If you're still here and realizing this was never just emotional betrayal, but something far more calculated, comment number 4 below. Because once I saw the truth in black and white, I made a call that could never be taken back. Now, let's move on to Chapter 5. While the launch event unfolded miles away along the coast of Santa Barbara, my house remained still. I did not watch the news or check social media. I did not imagine what was happening at the resort or who was speaking in whose place. I had learned, finally, that speculation was a luxury I could no longer afford. What mattered was what I could verify, document, and control. I sat at my desk with my notes arranged neatly beside my laptop. Dates, file names, and clauses were listed with the same care I had once given to pension plans and corporate mergers. The clarity from the afternoon had not faded. If anything, it had sharpened. I felt no urgency to confront Daniel or explain myself to anyone. Emotional reactions would only dilute what needed to be precise. I began with the first call, choosing the person who understood both my financial history and my expectations. I explained the situation succinctly, focusing on facts rather than feelings. There was a signed agreement, followed by a revised appendix created after the signing date. My signature had been reused without authorization. My authority within the project had been materially altered. I requested that the investor protection provisions be activated immediately and that a formal review be initiated. The response on the other end was measured and professional. Questions were asked. I answered them calmly. Documentation was requested. I sent it without delay. The conversation ended without reassurances or promises, only the understanding that a process had begun. That was enough. The second call followed without hesitation. I contacted the bank overseeing the project accounts, identifying myself by full name and account number. I confirmed my status as the primary source of capital and outlined the discrepancy I had uncovered. I requested a temporary freeze on operational authority, pending legal review, and asked that the project be flagged as under dispute. This was not a demand, but a formal request grounded in existing safeguards. There was a pause while my information was verified. I waited, hands folded, breathing steady. When the confirmation came, it was brief. The request would be reviewed immediately. The necessary departments would be notified. I thanked them and ended the call. Only then did I allow myself to lean back in my chair. The house was quiet, the late afternoon light stretching across the floor in long bands. Somewhere, the event was still in motion. Guests were likely unaware that the foundation beneath the celebration had begun to shift. I felt no satisfaction in that thought. There was no pleasure in disruption. There was only inevitability. What surprised me most was the absence of fear. For weeks, I had been bracing myself against discomfort, telling myself that the family complications were too delicate to address directly. Now that I had acted, that weight lifted. I understood that clarity, once achieved, demands action. Anything less would be a betrayal of self. I did not wait by the phone. I did not check for messages. The machinery I had set in motion would operate on its own timeline. Legal reviews do not respond to emotion, and banks do not negotiate with sentiment. That was precisely why I trusted the process. As evening settled in, I closed my laptop and stood, stretching the stiffness from my shoulders. I moved through the kitchen, preparing a simple meal, listening to the familiar sounds of my own home. The ordinary rhythm grounded me. It reminded me that my life did not revolve around a single event or a single relationship. By the time night fell, I understood that whatever happened next would no longer be shaped by assumptions or unspoken obligations. The calls I had made were not acts of retaliation. They were acknowledgments of reality. I had been excluded without explanation, redefined without consent, and altered without permission. Now, the situation belonged to the structures designed to handle exactly this kind of breach. I did not need to raise my voice or make an appearance. I had said everything that mattered through the correct channels. The wheel was turning, and for the first time since this began, I felt steady knowing that I had finally stepped out of the background and into my own authority. That night, the house felt heavier than it had earlier, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. I moved through the rooms without purpose, aware that something irreversible had already been set in motion. The calls I had made could not be taken back, but the consequences had not yet arrived. This was the space between action and impact, the moment when doubt has one last chance to speak. My phone rested face down on the table. Notifications came in quietly, one after another. I did not rush to read them. I understood what they would contain before I opened a single message. When I finally did, the language was formal and restrained. Acknowledgements from legal counsel, confirmation that documentation had been received, a note indicating further findings were under review. Nothing emotional, nothing dramatic. Just the steady advance of a process that did not care about family titles. Then came the detail that changed the shape of everything. Through the legal review, it emerged that the Whitman family had used the resort project as collateral for the personal loans. This had been done weeks earlier, before the launch event, and without my knowledge or consent. The amounts were not small. The loans were structured in a way that placed the underlying asset, and therefore my investment, at significant risk. It was not simply a breach of trust. It was exposure. If the project failed or defaulted, my name would have been tied to liabilities I never agreed to assume. I sat very still as I absorbed that information. The sense of betrayal sharpened, not because of the money, but because of what it revealed. This was not carelessness or misunderstanding. It was a decision made with confidence that I would absorb the consequences, as I always had. In that moment, I saw the pattern clearly. I had been protecting my son from the results of his choices for so long that he had learned to expect protection, not accountability. Memories surfaced uninvited. Daniel as a teenager, standing in the doorway after making a mistake, waiting for me to smooth things over. Daniel as a young man, confident that I would intervene if something went wrong. Each time I had told myself I was helping him stand on his feet. In truth, I had been standing in his place. The question I could no longer avoid was simple and devastating. If I stepped in again now, what would I be teaching him? That deception was survivable, that boundaries were negotiable, that my role as his mother meant erasing myself when it became inconvenient. I understood then that this was not about punishment. It was about responsibility. I could not claim to value integrity in my professional life and abandon it when it became uncomfortable in my personal one. The two could not coexist without destroying each other. I responded to my legal counsel with a brief confirmation. The review would continue, no accommodations, no exceptions. The process would follow its course without interference. My hands did not shake as I sent it. The decision had already been made long before my fingers touched the screen. Afterward, The silence returned, deeper than before. Grief settled in, not loud or dramatic, but persistent. I was not losing my son in the way people fear. I was losing the version of our relationship built on dependency and avoidance. That loss hurt more than anger ever could. Yet, alongside the pain was a sense of clarity I had not felt in years. I was no longer divided between who I was and who I pretended to be. I was no longer choosing peace at the expense of truth. The boundary I had drawn would not be crossed, not by guilt, not by history, not by love misused as leverage. As I turned off the lights and prepared for bed, I accepted what lay ahead. Daniel would have to face the consequences of his actions as an adult, not as a child shielded from discomfort. There would be no retreat from this decision. The door to easy forgiveness had closed, not out of cruelty but out of necessity. And once it closed, I knew it would not open again. If you're still watching and wondering whether a mother can truly stand firm when the consequences hit her own child, comment number 6 below. Because once that choice was made, the fallout came faster and harsher than anyone expected. Let's move on to Chapter 7. The days following the launch event no longer carried the quiet I had grown used to. I returned to my routine, attending meetings and reviewing reports, but the atmosphere around me had shifted. Emails arrived with increased frequency, their tone more cautious, more deliberate. The machinery I had set in motion was no longer silent. It was working. Official notices from the project began to circulate. Internal audits were announced, framed as procedural and neutral, yet everyone involved understood what they meant. Timelines were paused. Certain expenditures were placed on hold. Conversations that once focused on vision and celebration now revolved around documentation and accountability. The resort was no longer a symbol of success. It had become a file, thick with questions. Daniel felt the impact almost immediately. He was asked to clarify decisions he had once spoken about with confidence. Meetings he had led were reassigned. His authority, which had been assumed rather than earned, was suspended pending review. For the first time, he stood without a buffer. No one stepped in to smooth the edges or soften the consequences. I did not intervene. I had learned that silence, when intentional, can be more instructive than explanation. News traveled quickly within the circles the Whitman family valued most. There were no public accusations, no dramatic headlines, but the shift was unmistakable. Invitations slowed. Conversations grew shorter. People who once praised their taste and influence now kept a careful distance. In communities built on reputation, hesitation speaks louder than judgment. The family that had once stood confidently at the center of attention now moved cautiously along its edges. I became aware of opinions forming around me as well. Some viewed my actions as excessive, too firm for a mother. Others, often quieter, expressed understanding. A few reached out privately, sharing stories of boundaries drawn too late, of costs absorbed for the sake of peace. I listened without responding. Everyone brings their own history to a story like this, and I did not feel compelled to correct their interpretations. Internally, I experienced a range of emotions I had not anticipated. There was sadness, of course, a steady ache that surfaced in unexpected moments. I missed the ease of believing that love alone could prevent harm, but regret did not follow. Each development confirmed what I already knew. The issues were not born from my response. They had existed long before I chose to see them clearly. As the situation unfolded, I noticed a subtle change in myself. The constant vigilance I had carried for years began to ease. I no longer felt responsible for managing outcomes that were not mine to control. The tension that once accompanied every family interaction faded, replaced by a calmer, more grounded awareness. I had not lost compassion. I had simply reclaimed balance. What struck me most was how naturally things began to settle once I stopped holding them together. The chaos I had feared did not erupt. Instead, structures adjusted, relationships redefined themselves, and responsibilities shifted to where they belonged. Consequences, when allowed to function, do not require supervision. By the end of the week, it was clear that the narrative had changed. The resort project would move forward only after scrutiny, if at all. Daniel would have to answer for his choices as an adult, not as a son shielded by familiarity. The Whitman family would navigate the discomfort of accountability in a world that had rarely challenged them. I stood at a distance from all of it, not detached but no longer entangled. I did not feel victorious. I felt present. The ground beneath me was firm again, no longer shifting with the expectations of others. In allowing consequences to speak, I had finally stopped speaking for everyone else. That, I realized, was the quiet beginning of a new order. In the weeks that followed, my life settled into a quieter, more deliberate rhythm. The chaos that had once surrounded me receded, replaced by structure and intention. Each morning, I returned to my office not as a woman reacting to betrayal, but as someone rebuilding order. I did not rush this phase. I understood now that repair requires patience as much as courage. I began by reviewing every financial and legal thread that had tied me to Daniel and the Whitman family. It was a meticulous process, one I approached without bitterness. I asked my legal team to prepare a full separation of interests, not as a gesture of punishment, but as a necessity. Clarity, I had learned, is an act of respect toward oneself. Each document signed, each account disentangled, felt less like a loss and more like a release. There were moments when memories interrupted my focus. I would pause mid-sentence or linger over a line of text, reminded of the years I had spent believing that support meant proximity. I saw now how easily care can become currency when boundaries are unclear. That realization was painful, but it was also liberating. I no longer felt compelled to justify my decisions to anyone who had benefited from my silence. As the legal work progressed, I made changes closer to home. I reorganized my space, not dramatically but intentionally. Objects that carried the weight of obligation were set aside. In their place, I kept what reflected effort, growth, and independence. The house felt lighter, as if it too recognized the shift. I slept better. I breathed more easily. Professionally, I redirected my energy toward projects that had long waited for my full attention. Work had always grounded me, not as an escape, but as a reminder of who I was before my identity narrowed to a single role. I reconnected with colleagues and clients who valued my expertise without expectation of sacrifice. In those conversations, I felt seen again, not for what I could give, but for what I knew. What surprised me most was the absence of guilt. I had expected it to linger, to question my resolve. Instead, what remained was a steady sense of alignment. I was no longer negotiating my worth in exchange for belonging. I had stopped shrinking to fit into spaces that never truly welcomed me. I did not reach out to Daniel during this time, nor did he reach out to me in a way that suggested accountability. That silence, once terrifying, became instructive. It confirmed what I had already accepted. Healing does not always come with reconciliation. Sometimes it comes with distance and the wisdom to maintain it. As I moved forward, I allowed myself to imagine a future not defined by repair, but by choice. I began making plans that had nothing to do with fixing what was broken. Travel, mentorship, quiet mornings shaped by my own preferences rather than obligation. These were not acts of defiance. They were acknowledgments of possibility. By the end of that season, I understood something fundamental. I had not lost anything essential. What I had relinquished were illusions, and the cost of maintaining them, In reclaiming my time, my resources, and my authority, I was not becoming someone new. I was returning to the woman I had always been, before compromise became habit. The path ahead was clear, not because it promised ease, but because it belonged entirely to me. If you're still here and curious about how everything finally ended and what freedom really looked like on the other side, comment number 8 below, because the final outcome was quieter than revenge, but far more powerful. Now, let's move on to the ending of this story. Time moved forward quietly, without ceremony. Weeks turned into months, and the tension that once defined my days slowly dissolved into something calmer and more settled. The legal process reached its conclusion without drama. Documents were finalized, accounts were separated, and responsibilities were clearly reassigned. When it was over, there was no celebration, only a deep sense of closure, like closing a door that had been left open far too long. I learned about Daniel's situation indirectly. Friends mentioned it carefully, as if unsure whether I wanted to know. His professional standing had weakened. Without borrowed authority or unspoken protection, his choices were examined more closely, and the confidence he once carried no longer shielded him. Opportunities became limited. Trust, once assumed, now had to be earned. I listened without comment. Knowing was enough. I did not need details to understand the lesson life was teaching him. The Whitman family faded from the social circles that had once embraced them so enthusiastically. In places where status depends on perception, distance becomes its own verdict. Invitations stopped coming. Familiar faces turned polite but distant. There were no public accusations, only quiet exclusion. I felt no satisfaction watching this unfold. Their decline was not my victory. It was simply the consequence of choices made without accountability. My own life, however, expanded in ways I had not anticipated. Without the constant pull of obligation, my days felt lighter. I chose how to spend my time and with whom. I returned to work with renewed focus, not because I needed distraction, but because it reminded me of my competence and independence. I mentored younger colleagues, especially women who struggled to balance ambition with family expectation. In their questions, I recognized pieces of my past self. At home, peace replaced vigilance. Mornings were unhurried. Evenings belonged to me. I found comfort in routines that once felt selfish, but now felt necessary. Reading, cooking, sitting quietly without explanation. These moments restored parts of me I had set aside for years. There were still moments of grief. Certain memories surfaced unexpectedly, carrying a sharp ache. I allowed those feelings to exist without questioning my decisions. Loving my son had never been a mistake. Believing in family had not been wrong. What I released was the belief that love required endless sacrifice. One evening, standing by the window as the sun lowered over the ocean, I realized how far I had come. The world had not ended because I chose myself. It had grown clearer, steadier, and more honest. I was no longer living in reaction to others. I was living in alignment with who I had always been. This was not the life I once imagined, but it was a life I finally owned. When I look back now, I no longer see the story as one of betrayal alone. I see it as a lesson I was meant to learn late in life, when it mattered most. What happened forced me to confront a truth I had avoided for years. Love that demands silence, endurance, and self-erasure is not love. It is control disguised as family loyalty. For a long time, I believed strength meant holding everything together at any cost. I believed a good mother absorbed discomfort so her child would never have to. That belief shaped my choices, my patience, and my blindness. Letting go of it was painful, but it was also the moment I began to breathe freely again. I did not walk away because I lacked compassion. I walked away because compassion without boundaries becomes self-destruction. There is a quiet guilt that society places on women like me, especially mothers. We are taught that firmness is cruelty and that self-respect is selfishness. I carried that weight for years, convincing myself that my value lay in how much I could give without complaint. Only when I stopped did I realize how much of myself I had lost along the way. The truth is simple, even if it is uncomfortable. Being related to someone does not grant them unlimited access to your resources, your dignity, or your silence. Love does not excuse deception. Family does not justify exploitation. When those lines are crossed, choosing distance is not abandonment, it is survival. I do not tell this story to inspire anger or revenge. I tell it to remind others, especially women who have spent decades putting themselves last, that it is never too late to choose differently. You are allowed to say no. You are allowed to step back. You are allowed to protect what you have built with your own hands and your own sacrifices. Today, my life is quieter, but it is honest. I wake without tension in my chest. I make decisions without fear of displeasing anyone. I carry sadness, yes, but I also carry peace. That peace came the moment I stopped negotiating my worth. If there is one message I would leave behind, it is this. Freedom does not come from winning battles or proving points. It comes from standing still, looking at the truth, and choosing yourself without apology. When you do, the world does not shrink. It opens. And that, I have learned, is the most powerful ending of all. Some stories do not end with reconciliation or applause. They end with clarity. When the noise fades and the dust settles, what remains is a quiet truth. Self-respect is not selfish, and boundaries are not betrayals. Life has a way of testing how much we are willing to sacrifice for the comfort of others, and whether we remember to include ourselves in that equation. Growth often arrives disguised as loss, and freedom sometimes looks like walking away rather than holding on. This journey reminds us that dignity cannot be negotiated, and love should never require silence or erasure. When we choose honesty over habit and courage over fear, we reclaim something priceless, the right to live in alignment with who we truly are. Peace does not come from fixing everything around us, but from finally standing firm within ourselves. Thank you for staying until the end of this story. If it made you reflect on boundaries, family, or self-worth, share your thoughts in the comments. Do not forget to like, follow, and subscribe for more stories that speak to real life and real strength.